Hollywood is in mourning. The luster has faded, the heartbeat has broken. On October 11th, 2025, Diane Keaton, a fearless soul who redefined love, truth, and imperfection on screen, breathed her last breath in the quiet of her California home. For more than 5 decades, she was more than an actress. She was an era. A rebel in a turtleneck. A voice for the unseen. Her laughter lit up generations. Her silence now echoes for eternity. Before we begin this tribute, please like this as a final tribute to Diane Keaton, a woman who gave her heart to the world until the end. Los Angeles, 1946. Under the warm California sun, a young girl steps into a world built on dreams and tranquility. Diane Keaton is born into a seemingly perfect family, the epitome of mid-century American idealism, but behind those glittering doors, a different reality lurks. Her father, Jack Hall, is a serious civil engineer, the kind who believes that order is love, precision, structure, rules. That is his language. Her mother, Dorothy Diane Keaton Hall, has a burning desire for the stage. She has stood on stage, winning the title of Mrs. Los Angeles in 1955, smiling brightly under the spotlight. For a brief moment, the world seems to welcome her. But as the years have passed, the light has faded. She stepped out of her dream into the role expected of women in the 1950s. The devoted housewife, the woman who made it all look easy while silently sacrificing everything that was hers. The Halls had rules, strict rules. The 4 children lined up neatly at dinner. There was always a prayer before meals, and laughter was reserved for guests. Perfection was practiced daily, as if the family were characters in a carefully scripted play. To outsiders, they were the model American family, polite, smiling, calm. But when the front door closed, the air became heavy. Emotions were never spoken. They simply existed, unresolved, like wallpaper that everyone saw but no one spoke of. The silence wasn't intense. It was worse. It was persistent. It seeped into the walls, into the rhythm of their daily lives, into the way love was given without ever being named. Diane, then 9, would stand in the kitchen doorway watching her mother. She saw Dorothy's smile fade as soon as no one was looking. She saw her mother's dreams not fade. They slowly, silently evaporate, with each dishwashing and each curtain drawn. In that daily grind, Diane learned something no child should learn so young. Joy can disappear without a word. It doesn't explode, it evaporates. Years later, she called her mother's life a warning, not a map. That warning became her guide. Even as a child, she knew she couldn't live that way. She wouldn't be another woman swallowed up by silence and expectation. While other girls in the 1950s dreamed of white picket fences and forever homes, Diane dreamed of liberation, of scripts, of light, to a stage where she could be herself. That vow, unspoken but intense, became the foundation of everything she would do. I will not live my mother's life, she decided, not with words, but with the quiet defiance of a girl watching and learning. At school, she never really fit in. Teachers called her difficult. Friends called her strange. But Diane wasn't breaking down. She was breaking out of the mold. Her rebellion wasn't loud. It was like a volcano, burning beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to erupt. She had an endless energy, a private fire that made her both misunderstood and unforgettable to everyone who met her. Then came the moment that changed everything. In high school, she stepped on stage for the first time, playing Blanche Dubois. The lights shook, and so did she. Her hands shook, her voice trembled, but something extraordinary happened. As she read her lines, she felt all eyes on her. No judgment, no pretense, just watching. The silence that had defined her childhood was shattered, replaced by a new kind of silence. A silence that listened. Years later, she said, "It was the first time I felt seen." It wasn't a performance. It was a person. For a girl raised in silence, the stage had become her language. Under the spotlight, she found a way to express what her family never could. She wasn't just acting, she was breathing for the first time. Behind her, a house filled with unspoken emotions. Ahead, a world that still didn't know her name. But on that stage, Diane Keaton began the journey of defining her life. Not with applause, but with a silent promise to herself, to be true to herself, to live fully and on her own terms. The silence of Diane's childhood didn't vanish when the spotlight found her. It simply changed shape. Beneath the rising arc of her career, that quiet, unspoken yearning lingered. The longing to be truly seen, not just on stage, but in life. And then, one day in 1971, on a film set that would change cinematic history, that yearning met its echo. She was 25, standing under the buzzing lights of the Godfather set. He was 31, brilliant, enigmatic, already half lost inside the shadow of his own genius. Diane Keaton and Al Pacino, two souls who had spent their lives navigating loneliness in different languages, found themselves face to face. The air between them wasn't loud. It hummed softly like a frequency only they could hear. Their connection wasn't explosive. It was quiet, magnetic, inevitable. Diane would later confess, "I was crazy about him from the start." Pacino, reserved and unknowable, saw in her a light that wasn't trying to perform, it just existed. And she saw in him a depth that didn't need to explain itself. What began on set slowly unfolded into something extraordinary off-screen. They read lines together between takes, sitting cross-legged on studio floors. They drove through Los Angeles at night with Sinatra on the radio, the wind tangling her laughter. He would cook pasta in a too-small kitchen. She would make tea. They'd eat on the floor, talking about everything and nothing. There were no grand declarations, no Hollywood spectacle. Just two people, brilliant, strange, vulnerable, finding refuge in each other's silence. For nearly 2 decades, their love existed outside traditional boundaries. No labels, no wedding rings, no promises written down. But in countless quiet moments, it became the defining relationship of her life. Through the 1970s and 80s, as their careers soared, their bond remained a thread running just beneath the surface of fame. They were drawn together by something neither fully understood, and perhaps because of that, they could never quite hold on. Diane longed for a home, for stability, for a love that would anchor her after years of drifting through applause and empty kitchens. Pacino, on the other hand, feared the weight of commitment. "I avoid doors that might lead to pain," he would later admit. His distance wasn't cruelty, it was his way of surviving. But to Diane, who had once vowed never to live in silence, that distance felt achingly familiar. The same silence that had filled her childhood kitchen now stood between them, older, heavier. The turning point came in Rome, 1990, during the filming of The Godfather Part 3. By then, she was 44. Hope still flickered inside her like a stubborn flame refusing to die. One evening, under the honey-gold Italian sky, they sat together after dinner, the table scattered with half-finished wine and untouched bread. She looked at him, her voice trembling but steady. "Marriage or goodbye?" There was no fight, no storm, just silence. Pacino looked at her, then away. That silence was his answer. It was the same silence that had followed her all her life. Not hostile, not cruel, just empty. And in that emptiness, something inside her finally broke. That night, under the fading Roman light, she quietly packed her things. She folded her dreams between clothes that smelled faintly of wine and regret. As dawn crept over the city, she stood by the villa window, watching Rome glow one last time. She didn't cry, she simply left. The seat beside her on the plane was empty. It always had been. Their story didn't end with bitterness. It lingered like an unfinished melody. For Diane, that love was both a gift and a wound, something she carried quietly for the rest of her life. She never married. She never sought to replace him. She poured her heart into her work, her art, her children, but the space shaped by Al Pacino's absence remained like a shadow etched into her soul. Decades later, in 2017, at the American Film Institute's tribute to her life's work, the auditorium shimmered with applause. From the wings, Al Pacino appeared. Time folded in on itself. He walked to the podium, older now, his voice softer. He looked at her and said, "I love you forever." The crowd erupted, but Diane didn't cry. She smiled, a quiet, steady smile belonging to a woman who had already grieved in every possible way. The tears had been shed years earlier, in therapy rooms, in midnight kitchens, on long drives home where goodbyes echoed in silence. What remained was something softer: acceptance. Their love was never defined by duration or destination. It was defined by its echo. It was the love that taught her how to endure, the love that revealed that silence can both wound and shape. And so while the world remembers her roles, her wit, her unmatched screen presence, Diane's heart remembered something else. A man on a film set in 1971, a shared frequency, and a silence that changed everything. Love for Diane was never just a story, it was a mirror. In Al Pacino, she had found a reflection of both her deepest connection and her oldest silence. But long before that quiet love took root, there was another silence she had to confront. The one that comes when you step into a city that doesn't know your name and doesn't care to learn it. To understand the woman who loved so deeply, you must return to the girl who first stood alone against the world. New York City, 1966. Diane was 20. She left Los Angeles with a single suitcase, a handful of scripts, and a promise to herself: she would live life on her own terms. The plane touched down not just in another city, but in another universe. The lights of Manhattan were dazzling, but beneath their glow was a cold, indifferent rhythm, a city that tested everyone who dared to dream. She rented a small, crumbling apartment on the Upper West Side. The paint peeled from the walls like old skin. In winter, the radiator coughed, but never truly worked. At night, she slept in her coat, wrapping herself in layers of sweaters and scarves to keep out the biting cold. Her dinners were simple, often just soup or bread, but they carried the taste of determination. The city was relentless. She was too. Every day she hustled to auditions, clutching headshots and hope in equal measure. Casting agents glanced up and down, then dismissed her with polite smiles. Too odd, some said, not quite right. In a world that wanted conformity, Diane's sharp intelligence, quirky mannerisms, and striking individuality didn't fit the mold. But rejection didn't break her. It sharpened her edges. To survive, she waited tables. She sang in smoky basement clubs where her voice echoed through dim lights and the clink of glasses. Her rent checks barely cleared. But somewhere between exhaustion and hunger, fear became her fuel. "Fear became my engine," she would later say. The same fear that once haunted her childhood kitchen now propelled her through crowded subway platforms and icy streets. New York was unforgiving, but it was honest. It didn't care where she came from. It didn't pity her. It demanded everything, and she gave it. She learned to navigate rejection like a second language. She learned that failure wasn't an ending, but a rehearsal. And then, in 1968, everything changed. She walked into an audition for a new rock musical called Hair. It wasn't glamorous. The room smelled like sweat and cigarette smoke. The director sat cross-legged on the floor. Diane, barefoot, sang with a rawness that startled even her. She wasn't trying to impress. She was simply trying to exist. When she finished, the director looked up with a grin. She had the part. On opening night, standing on stage with nothing between her and the audience but air, she felt something electric. The same girl who once whispered vows in a silent kitchen was now screaming songs into the faces of strangers, and they were listening. The critics took note. The industry noticed. Broadway opened its doors just a crack, but it was enough. This was the first real turning point. Diane had clawed her way out of the cold shadows of New York and onto a stage that would lead her to Hollywood. That role in Hair wasn't just a job. It was proof. Proof that the girl who had been called too strange, too different, could take that difference and turn it into power. Looking back, Diane often says that New York wasn't gentle. It was the city that molded her. It was a city that forced her to choose, surrender or fight. And she chose to fight. The city that once greeted her with cold indifference became the forge that made her sharper, more resilient. She emerged from those winters stronger than ever. Before the spotlight was the cold of empty rooms, before the applause was silence, and in that silence she built herself, piece by piece. When she walked out of New York, she took not only her dreams but also her resilience, something you can't fake. She learned to be independent. From this moment on, her story was no longer about surviving the cold. It was about stepping straight into the heat of fame, a heat that can make or break anyone. The stage would be bigger, the lights will be brighter, the challenges will be higher than she ever imagined. She has the heart, the will, and the fire to overcome anything. But what about you? When you look at Diane at this point in her journey, what do you see? Strength, weakness, or maybe both? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every comment, and your voice matters. By the time Diane left New York behind, she wasn't just another young actress with a dream. She was a woman who had survived the cold, the silence, and the city itself. She carried with her a quiet fire, the kind that doesn't flare up for show but burns steady through every storm. What awaited her next wasn't survival anymore. It was glory, and the heavy cost that comes with it. The Godfather. She was cast as Kay Adams, standing in the shadow of Al Pacino's Michael Corleone. Her performance wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, it was honest, and it cut through the noise of Hollywood like a whisper that everyone suddenly leaned in to hear. The film didn't just make history, it made Diane Keaton a name everyone knew. Overnight, she went from struggling artist to rising star. Cameras followed her. Scripts piled up. Doors that once stayed shut now swung wide open. She walked through them not with arrogance, but with the quiet poise of someone who had fought too hard to get there, to take any of it for granted. But fame has its own kind of gravity. It pulls you upward fast, and just as quickly it starts to press down. Every headline came with expectation. Every interview came with scrutiny. Hollywood didn't just embrace her, it watched her, waiting to see if she could live up to the myth it had begun to build around her. Annie Hall. This time, Diane wasn't just part of a masterpiece. She was the beating heart of it. Her awkward laugh, her unapologetic turtlenecks, her unfiltered honesty, they weren't costumes. They were her. She didn't play Annie Hall. She was Annie Hall. She brought a kind of effortless truth to the screen that Hollywood didn't even know it was missing until she showed them. And for that, the world fell in love. The Academy did too. At 31, she held the golden statue in her hands, her name echoing in a room full of legends. It was the moment every actress dreams of, the world's grand stage finally turning toward her. But when the lights dimmed and the night was over, she returned home alone. In her quiet kitchen, surrounded by nothing but the hum of the refrigerator, she set her Oscar down on the counter and whispered to herself, "Is this what it feels like to be seen?" For the first time, success didn't fill the silence. It only made it louder. The applause faded, but the questions remained, echoing even louder than the cheers ever had. The years that followed weren't just about roles and awards. They were about pressure. relentless, gnawing pressure. Every script came with the unspoken question, can you ever be that good again? On set, she worked until her eyes stung. At night, she rewrote scenes no one asked her to rewrite. Sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford. She admitted later, I was scared to stop. The same determination that had carried her through New York's winters was now turned inward, becoming both her engine and her burden. Fame, she discovered, had its own weather, dazzling, brutal, impossible to control. The higher she climbed, the thinner the air became. Applause could lift her, but it couldn't hold her. And in those quiet moments between projects, she often found herself staring at the walls, wondering if the world loved her or the version of her they had created. By the early 1980s, that thin air turned cold. Films like The Little Drummer Girl faltered at the box office. Critics were harsher. The spotlight that once felt warm began to burn. For a woman who had once defined modern cinema, it felt like free fall. Everyone thought she was still on top, but inside she was slipping. So she did something rare in Hollywood. She stepped back, not out of defeat, but out of exhaustion. She turned down million-dollar roles because fame without truth felt like another kind of failure. She disappeared quietly, retreating into the shadows to rebuild. Because for Diane Keaton, the work, not the noise, was what had always saved her. This was her peak and her breaking point. A golden era shimmering with applause, hiding sleepless nights, whispered doubts, and a heart quietly unraveling. And somewhere behind that brilliant smile, her complicated love story with Al Pacino still lingered like a half-finished song. Beautiful, haunting, unfinished. She had fought through childhood silence. She had conquered New York's cold streets. And now, she stood at the height of her craft, facing a different kind of storm. One that came from within. If you're feeling the weight and wonder of Diane's journey so far, tap that like button and subscribe to the channel. It's a small gesture, but it helps keep stories like hers alive. Stories of courage, brilliance, and the human heart behind the legend. The applause had faded, the cameras had quieted, but inside Diane's heart, something else was unraveling. Behind the glittering surface of awards and accolades, her private world was entering its darkest winter. The price of greatness had never been just sleepless nights or critical pressure. It was heartbreak, real, devastating heartbreak. Rome, 1990. The golden light of the Italian dusk cast long shadows on a balcony strung with fairy lights. Diane was 44, and after nearly 2 decades of love that never quite found its shape, she finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had lingered between them for years. Marriage or goodbye? Across the table, Al Pacino sat silent. No storm, no argument, just that unbearable stillness of a man retreating into himself. He didn't have to say no. The silence said it for him. It was a soft, devastating silence, the kind that doesn't shatter like glass but sinks like stone. In that moment, something inside her cracked. The stubborn flame that had burned for him since 1971 finally flickered out. That night, she quietly packed her suitcase. She folded dreams between layers of clothes that still smelled faintly of wine and Roman air. And just when heartbreak had hollowed her, life dealt its cruelest hand. A few weeks after returning to America, the phone rang. Her father, Jack Hall, her quiet compass, the man who had waited outside auditions reading a newspaper, the man who never asked her to be smaller, had collapsed. The diagnosis was merciless, a brain tumor. The timing was almost unbearable, as if fate had chosen to take from her everything that had ever held her steady. Hospitals became her new stage. Fluorescent lights replaced spotlights. The hum of machines became the soundtrack to her days. She sat at his bedside, holding the same hand that had once led her to school, whispering, "Don't go yet, Dad. I'm not ready." But death doesn't wait for permission. Jack Hall had been the one who never tried to shape her into something she wasn't. He was the still point in a life of chaos, steady, silent, and endlessly proud. Losing him wasn't just grief. It was like losing the last light left on in the house. After the funeral, the house grew unbearably quiet. Lamps stayed on long after midnight, as if electricity itself refused to accept he was gone. She wandered through rooms that once echoed with his presence, touching his desk, his chair, whispering, "I'm trying, Dad, I really am." But the silence that answered her was the kind that changes you forever. The weeks blurred into months. Her famously sharp wit turned inward, becoming a blade instead of a shield. Friends stopped calling, she stopped answering. The woman who had once lit up Hollywood with her laugh now sat in silence, unraveling in slow motion. Therapy became her last ritual, not to heal completely, but to stay alive. She began facing truths she had avoided for decades. That love, for her, had always been a waiting room. That she had spent a lifetime hoping to be chosen first, only to realize she never was. "I don't think people understand what it means to feel like you're never the first choice," she once confessed. There was no bitterness in her voice, just a quiet, aching truth. In those dark months, the Diane the world adored disappeared from the spotlight. No headlines, no cameras, just a woman alone in a house too quiet, learning how to breathe again. She wasn't rebuilding for the world anymore. She was rebuilding for herself. The love she had lost in Rome and the love she lost in a hospital room arrived hand in hand, breaking her open in ways no film ever could. This was the lowest valley of her life, the kind of pain that doesn't announce itself, but settles into your bones. But even here, in the silence of loss, the seeds of resilience began to stir. Diane Keaton had survived cold winters before, but this time the storm was inside her. And slowly, painfully, she began to do what she had always done. Pick up the pieces, quietly, determinedly, without asking anyone to save her. She learned to stop waiting at doors that would never open. She began to build a home within herself. And though grief had marked her, it did not define her. This was where her real reconstruction began. Not on a stage, not under a spotlight, but in the stillness of a woman who had lost everything and decided to keep living anyway. Before we move on to the final chapter of Diane's extraordinary journey, a chapter of rebirth, legacy, and quiet triumph, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this story from? Whether it's day or night where you are, whether you're in Los Angeles, Rome, or anywhere in between, drop your country in the comments below. It's amazing to see how her story connects hearts all over the world. Grief doesn't disappear, it reshapes you. After losing the two pillars of her life, the man she loved and the father who had silently held her up, Diane entered a quiet season, not one of defeat, but of rebuilding. She had spent her youth chasing light, her middle years navigating storms, and now she began to build something softer, slower, something entirely her own. From the darkness of loss, Diane emerged not with grand gestures, but with small, steady steps. She turned her gaze inward, toward art, toward family, toward the pieces of life that could not be taken away. And it was here, in this unexpected chapter, that she found a love that stayed. In 1996, at the age of 50, Diane adopted her daughter, Dexter. 5 years later, she welcomed her son, Duke. They weren't afterthoughts, they were everything. For the first time, she wasn't waiting in anyone's shadow. She wasn't hoping to be chosen. She was choosing. Her home in Brentwood, California, became a sanctuary filled with children's laughter, creaky floorboards, and sunlight spilling through old windows she'd lovingly restored herself. The woman who once chased stage lights now spent afternoons with paintbrushes, blueprints, and bedtime stories. She didn't retreat from creativity, she simply reshaped it. Diane poured her energy into renovating historic homes, writing journals daily, and occasionally stepping back into film on her own terms. No longer for applause, but for the joy of the craft. She wasn't chasing Hollywood anymore. She was living. And then came October 11th, 2025. The house was quiet that morning. In her private library, a room lined with decades of journals, photographs, and first editions, Diane sat by the window with a cup of tea. The steam still rose gently from the porcelain when her heart gave out. She passed away in the most Diane Keaton way imaginable, surrounded by her stories, in silence, without spectacle, just as she had lived, quietly remarkable. News of her passing rippled through Hollywood like a tremor. Al Pacino's statement was brief, almost broken. "Forever, Diane." Meryl Streep called her the heartbeat of an era. Steve Martin said she made truth look effortless. Across generations, tributes poured in, not out of obligation, but out of love. The industry didn't just lose an actress, it lost a standard. A soul who reminded everyone that imperfection is where beauty lives. Her estate, valued at over $100 million, was divided between her children and the preservation funds she had supported for decades. True to her spirit, her legacy wasn't just about film. It was about leaving the world a little more honest, a little more beautiful than she had found it. But perhaps Diane's greatest legacy couldn't be measured in money or awards. It lived in the quiet revolutions she inspired. She changed what it meant to be a woman in Hollywood, not by playing the game, but by rewriting the rules. She stood firm in her quirks, her solitude, her honesty, and in doing so, gave countless women permission to do the same. Her films may have captured hearts, but her way of being changed lives. In one of her last journal entries, she wrote, "I used to fear loneliness. Now I know it's where love comes home." It wasn't a line meant for the world. It was a truth she had earned through silence, storms, love, loss, and finally, peace. As we look back at her journey, from the little girl in Los Angeles watching her mother fade, to the determined young woman surviving New York winters, to the luminous star of The Godfather and Annie Hall, to the heartbroken lover in Rome, and finally to the wise woman in her sunlit library. One thing is clear. Diane Keaton's story was never about perfection. It was about courage. It was about choosing authenticity when the world offered applause. She didn't just live a life. She built a legacy, not with noise, but with truth. And long after the credits roll, that legacy lingers like the last note of a beautiful song. We've walked through her story together, from the roots of loneliness to the quiet glow of legacy. But now, I'd love to hear from you. After journeying through the chapters of Diane's life, do you find yourself quietly admiring her too? Maybe even loving her in your own way? And where are you watching this from? What corner of the world are you in right now? Share your thoughts and your country down in the comments. It's beautiful to see how one woman's story can connect so many hearts across the globe. And that is the story of Diane Keaton, a woman who grew up in silence, carved her own path through the cold, loved fearlessly, lost heartbreak, and ultimately left an unforgettable legacy. She was more than a star. She was a force. A role model for anyone who has ever felt overlooked, a reminder that truth has power and that even the quietest souls can make the loudest noise. If Diane's journey touches your heart, if somewhere in her story you see a piece of yourself, let's keep her spirit alive. Hit that like button to celebrate her life, her courage, and her extraordinary legacy. And if you want to join us in discovering more untold stories of Hollywood, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment. This is more than a story. It's a reminder that behind every legend is a beating heart. And some stories are so beautiful, so human, they can't be forgotten. Thank you for watching.